I think we're good. I have a dislocated and broken shoulder, but I'm here to talk about how an 80-year-old scientist taught me about adaptation. So I figured this is appropriate as topic as any today. So I was walking alongside a man named Bristol Foster on the edge of a tiny airfield in Haida Gwaii, an archipelago about 40 miles off the coast of British Columbia. He was, I think, 80 or 82 at the time, and he was just out of the hospital on the islands. And we were walking on this airfield together. He was wearing these like Adidas cross trainers that just skimmed the grass, as he shuffled forward. And I remember looking at him and his eyes were just locked on the sea. He didn't want to wait inside the airport for our flight that was due to leave in an hour or so. He wanted to smell the fresh air. He wanted the smell of the tide, which there is so strong. The smell of life just going in and out. And at one point he stopped and there's a fence and he grabbed it with one hand. He shook it and he said, this never used to be here. I said, oh yeah? He said, yeah, I used to walk around the entire way along this airfield waiting for flights when I was a lot younger. And then he paused and he looked at the fence again and he looked at the top. He said, it's not quite hoppable, eh? And so I smiled at the idea of this 80-year-old man considering hopping a fence. So knowing Bristol, he probably would have tried it all those years ago. And he might have even tried it had I let him that day. So none of this walk or my hanging out with Bristol was really supposed to be happening. When our ship had arrived a few days earlier, Bristol had seemed confused and he was tired. The expedition leader had called me ahead of time and said, Bristol is just not himself right now. And he was on board as a naturalist, someone who knew as much of the biology and the animal life along the coast of British Columbia and Haida Gwaii as anyone. So while the other guests explored the village and met with different carvers and Haida leaders, we brought Bristol to the hospital. And it turned out he was dehydrated, and which is serious at his age. And by the time that he was finally released and I took care of him, I was the expedition developer for the program, the ship had already sailed. So there we were. It was me and Bristol walking along the airport. And I want to share what makes Bristol so special. I hired Bristol a year earlier after I had secured the route from Seattle up through British Columbia to Alaska that would call into the islands of Haida Gwaii. We were invited by the Haida Nation and Parks Canada, and it to this day is one of my most proud achievements to bring our ships together with the Haida people in a way that really honored their wishes. And as soon as we secured the itinerary, my boss said, you got to call Bristol Foster. Bristol's a biologist. He's a naturalist, and he's a man who studied island species across British Columbia. And in the late 60s, he noticed a pattern. And that was that on islands, bigger animals that are on land tend to get smaller, and smaller animals on land tend to get bigger. This isn't randomly, but it's because the island demands it. Food is limited, space is constrained, conditions are different. Sometimes they may not have the predators that they would have on land, and so species adapt. And it's really adaptation at its most pragmatic. The island decides what works. And while we were walking, Bristol said, it's sort of a PS to Darwin, which is a pretty cool thing to say about your work. This theory of Bristol's became known as Foster's rule. And he didn't like that. He said, who cares if your name's on it? Who the heck's Foster? And as long as the work serves the people, that's really all that matters. And so he preferred the name Island Rule. But as we walked along the airfield, he pointed things out with just this quiet joy. A bird burst out from behind a bush and he said, pigeon falcon, in a flash. This is someone who was in the hospital for 2 days just before this. And he thought about the bird and he said, or it's a merlin too. I like that name better. Let's call him a merlin. We kept going, and what I saw as simple bushes became rose hips, perfect for making tea that he liked. What I saw as these little white berries became snowberries. And there was a burnt out stump of an old tree that he walked up to and called a wondrous stump. This is just the kind of man that Bristol is. And it's when I realized that he wasn't just out walking on the airfield to stretch his legs. He was being who he was, despite the hospital stay, despite the fence, despite missing the ship, despite his flight home waiting for us, and an hour or so, he was adapting to the situation. And so I've thought about this in the years since and come to the conclusion that island rule, it can be about biology. And I didn't fully understand it then, but I think I do a little bit now, or at least enough that it suits me and hopefully it suits you. And that's that Foster's rule is not just about animals on islands. It's about what any environment asks of us. The islands don't care who you used to be or what you want to be. They care about what works here, and you need to adapt to it. And life is full of islands for all of us. You have a new job, you break your shoulder. Maybe you were hired for a leadership role and you don't feel ready for it. You get married, you become a parent, you name it. Life is full of these different islands that we all find ourselves on. When I did become the director of expedition development for Lindblad Expeditions and National Geographic, I was suddenly responsible for millions in revenue, the movings along with partners of hundreds of staff, tons of decisions, trips, people, weather, you name it. And this is for guests who had sometimes saved their entire lives for this trip. And I found myself in my own little new island moment, and I panicked. I doubted myself. I had complete imposter syndrome. I wondered if I belonged, when the time would come when people realized that I should not have been hired for this job. The things that had once made me feel big, back in the marketing department, the confidence, the certainty, the momentum that I felt because I knew what I was doing, it suddenly felt oversized. It was unsustainable. And the things that I had ignored, asking questions, slowing down, admitting when I didn't know the answer, listening, I had to grow. And so I want to share that if you're standing on your own new island right now, these are the questions that I wish I had asked myself sooner. And that's what parts of me are too big for this place? What are the old identities that I'm holding on to, old coping mechanisms, old measures of success that no longer matter on this island? What parts of me need to grow? Is it curiosity? Is it patience, humility? You want to ask, what are you trying to force of yourself that this island now, this situation is asking me to just let go of? So when it came to moving on or pivoting from things that I loved most deeply, I used to see it as quitting or acknowledging defeat, which you never give. But I've found since talking to Bristol that adaptation is really intelligence. It's movement, it's change over time. And Bristol couldn't hop that fence anymore, but he didn't need to. So he had found another way to move through the world with purpose. And my time with Bristol ended as we reached the edge of the airfield, and we knew we had to go back to the airport. Our flight was boarding in about an hour, but it was such a small airport that really we could have shown up 15 minutes ahead of the flight. And I looked at my watch and I said, it looks like we got some time to kill. Bristol, what do you want to do? And Bristol stopped. He turned towards the breeze and he said, Mark, I think time's too valuable to kill. Maybe we say, we have extra time to explore. And so we did. And I've been trying to live that way ever since, thanks to Bristol. And so I'm going to leave you by asking one question. And that is, what island are you on right now? And what is it quietly asking you to become? Thanks so much for listening to this story and learning a little bit about Bristol. He is really one of the most special people I've ever met. And thanks for subscribing to my Substack, watching this on YouTube, hopefully. And please subscribe because there's a lot more coming along with chapters of my memoir, The Great Sea Ahead.